Hi, this is Max Newberry. Uh, I decided that I would record as much as I can remember of some of the events in my life so that maybe future generations will understand where their ancestors came from and a little bit about my background. I know I would love to have had more information on my ancestors. So here's my attempt to do it. It'll be recorded in several different segments due to the length of it. And excuse my drainage hoarseness. I was born in Gould, Oklahoma in 1935 on July the 26th, and my birth took place at our home in Gould, which was the common practice back then. The period that I will talk about now is when I was growing up in Gould. It was in a rental house that no longer exists. It was just immediately to the south of the current big water tower in Gould. By the way, Gould was named in honor of my great-grandfather, Gould. He moved from the Georgia area back in about 1900 into Hollis, where he built a rooming hotel, boarding and rooming, and he encouraged his daughter Maggie and her husband Jack to move from St. Louis to a new town that was being built just to the east of Hollis, which was later named in his honor. He built the first house in Gould for his daughter and son-in-law, and they had well, it was a business that sold groceries and hardware and things like that. He also built a rooming house there in Gould, which my grandmother Maggie Atterbury managed and cooked for. So, in this store that my grandfather Atterbury ran, they set up a post office, and my grandfather Atterbury was the first postmaster for the town. Well, it was his duty to come up with a name for the town, and he chose Gibson in honor of the man whose land the town was being developed on. However, the Postal Service decided that they couldn't name it Gibson since there was already a Fort Gibson. So, since my great-grandfather had constructed the first business and home in Gould, he decided to name it in honor of him. So he named it Gould. We have a very long association with the town of Gould. Well, when I was born, my father, Earl, was superintendent of the school in Gould. And in 1937, he was responsible for building a building that housed the gymnasium and the grade school there. He was very proud of the fact that he was able to accomplish this without any issuance of bonds. He did this through the use of Workers Program Agency, or WPA, and insurance money from the previous building that had burned down. My father was a telescope maker, and while we lived there, he constructed a 12-inch telescope, which he said you could see the head of a nail on from a distance of a mile. He later traded this telescope to the university at Gunnison, Colorado, in exchange for his tuition and other benefits to get his master's degree at Gunnison. The house that I was born in was rented by my father and mother, and my memory is very limited of the time I was there, but I do remember that my father liked to hunt, and one time he left some .22 shells not used in the floor of the car, and I found them and I took them over to see my buddy next door with the name of Ducky Duval, and we decided we would make them go off. And to do that, we would put them on a rock and take a hammer and hit them. Just as we were preparing to do that, our parents caught us and stopped us, probably saved my life. I remember when I was about 3 years old, on the 4th of July, that my mother and father had gone somewhere and left me with a babysitter. And I heard the firecrackers going off, and she had some firecrackers, and she was lighting them and throwing them out, and I thought, gee, that looks like fun. And I begged her to let me do it. Well, she didn't want to do that, but finally, after me begging her for a long time, she consented to do it. And so she handed the firecracker to me, and I held it, and she lit it, and I looked at it, and she says, "Throw it, Max, throw it." And I said, "Huh?" And about that time, it went off, and it really hurt me. It wasn't a real big firecracker, but it was enough to raise a blister on my finger. And I didn't want anything to do with firecrackers again until I was a teenager. My mother liked to tell stories about how I couldn't pronounce my GRs. I would use D. And one time I came in the house with grease all over me, and she says, "Max, what have you got all over you?" And I said, "Deece in the Dodge." She liked to tell that about me. She also liked to tell the story about one time I found a turtle, and my brother John warned me. He says, "Max, watch out now. Don't let that turtle bite you, because it won't turn loose until it thunders." And I said, Well, John, I didn't know turtles thundered. So that's some of my memories of growing up in Gould. Uh, my father left Gould in 1940 to uh, become superintendent in a little town to the east of there, about 20 miles, by the name of Martha, Oklahoma. And we had a house adjacent to the railroad tracks by about 100 yards. And I vividly remember this was at the end of the Depression, and people were still riding the railroad cars. We called them hobos. They would hitch rides from one town to another, and since the train stopped there in Martha, they would get off of that train where they had bummed rides in the freight cars and walk over to our house and ask if they could have some food. And as I recall, Mother always gave it to them. We had a dog that lived about 1941 or 2, and somehow or another got his leg broke, and we were all upset and crying, and kids, and Dad was pondering what to do about whether to put him down or take him to the vet, which would cost quite a bit of money that he didn't have. And so as he was discussing that with my mother, I pleaded with him, well, Dad, isn't he worth it? But isn't he worth it? Still couldn't pronounce my words very good back then. Well, we had a car. It was a 1940 Chevrolet, and we were, excuse me, phone's ringing. There. My mother was driving it from Martha to Gould, and was driving it on the highway and saw some smoke from a grass fire beside the road, and she had no option other than to slow down and drive through it. And when she got into the middle of it, I saw this too, that there were already cars that had wrecked in that smoke. It was bigger than she thought it was. And I remember this person coming out and yelling, "Go get an ambulance." And that's the last I recall, because a car was coming behind us and slammed into the rear of our car and threw me back against the window and knocked me out. And Mother was able, the car was wrecked, but Mother was able to get us all out of there and took me to the hospital, and I had to spend the night because they wanted to make sure I was all right, which I was. We lived in 3 different houses while we were in Martha, and Dad was superintendent. And because they sold houses or they found a better house to live in. And in each of these houses, we had cows and we had chickens, and all of this was necessary to because teachers weren't paid very much, and you had to do everything you could to make life good. I remember when I was 5 years old that we lived across from this farmer who raised cotton, and I pulled bows, cotton bows, for him. Didn't pull very much, but I had a little sack that I was able to pull bows and make some money, which was really something for me back then to have when I was only about 9 years old. I remember there was this cute little girl that lived not too far from us, and she would come over and visit, and we were good friends. And when we had decided to move to the farm from Martha, she came over and we were talking, and she says, "Well, Max, who do you like?" And I said, "Well, you, I like you." And so I said, "Well, who do you like?" And she had her little dog with her, and she reached over and petted the dog and said, "I like my doggy." Well, that just broke my heart. So, because the car was wrecked, we didn't have any transportation, and Dad bought a school bus which had been put into storage because they had replaced it. It was very old. It was built back in the late 20s or early 30s. And we used that for our transportation for until 1945, because the war was on and you couldn't buy a car. And so Dad cut the back end out of the school bus and made a truck out of it with a room in the front for the 5 of us, my 2 brothers and I and Mom and Dad, where we could ride. I remember very well that when the war was over in 1945, that the car manufacturers rapidly began making new cars, and Dad was able to get the first new Ford sold in Gould in 1946 for our car. And he was the first because he was the one that was deemed the most needed of a new car. Let me check my notes and see if I've got anything else to talk about during this period. I do remember one other thing that I want to talk about, and as I mentioned, we raised chickens at every place we lived in Martha. Well, back then, Mother wasn't comfortable killing chickens, and she would always ask a neighbor across the street to kill the chicken for her. And it was our job, John and I, to take the chicken over to the neighborhood lady for that. Well, one day we figured, well, there's no need of doing this. We can just take care of it ourselves. And so the way we decided we'd take care of it was to put a string around its neck, looped around its neck, and put it over a tree limb and string it up. And of course, the chicken was squawking and raising a lot of noise, and my mom came running out and rescued the chicken. When we got on the farm, Mother got over her reluctance to kill the chickens for our meals. I think that pretty well covers the first 10 years of my life. It's 9 or 10 years. I went through the first 3 grades in the Martha School where my father was superintendent, and then started 4th grade when we moved to the farm and we went to Google schools for our schooling through the high school years. I will come back with the next scene after a bit.